Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Kant, I know you've been having a very busy schedule, but we'll try and keep this, we're very happy to start the year with you. At PAFI, this is the first session that we have. And it's wonderful to have you here to speak at the annual lecture. Mr. Amitabh Kant, G20 Sherpa, Government of India, Virat, President PAFI, Vinita, Vice President PAFI, Excellencies, senior diplomats, members and friends of PAFI, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Kant, we at PAFI are grateful to you for agreeing to deliver the third annual PAFI lecture on the topic, the role of business in G20. Mr. Kant needs no introduction here at PAFI. I think in all your avatars, sir, you have been here, you have guided us, you have advised us, and it's been a privilege to receive this guidance and support at the various interactions over the years. A 1980 batch IAS officer of Kerala Cadre, he has been the key driver of several campaigns of the Government of India, from Make in India to Startup India, Incredible India, and something which we all still remember is the God's Own Country campaign in Kerala. So given the long-lasting impact that he has on all the campaigns, I think it's not a surprise that he's now been chosen to be the G20 Sherpa during India's presidency at the G20 to drive the Honorable Prime Minister's vision of ensuring that India's contribution is clearly visible in the future agenda of G20 and also establish India as the key voice of the Global South. Some of the key topics India has chosen to focus on the G20 include financing mechanism for climate change technologies, health infrastructure, as also strengthening multilateralism across the world, something which India has been very keen and India has been a great player of over the last few years, besides many other very important other sectors that we are focusing on. Sir, with member companies in PAFI representing large Indian and foreign transnationals across nearly all sectors of the economy, PAFI would be happy to work with you and your colleagues to provide business inputs towards building a strong, inclusive, sustainable, and growth-oriented agenda for the G20 during India's presidency. We look forward to your advice and guidance on how PAFI can be an important partner in this G20 process. Thank you, and Virat, over to you. Take over the proceedings. Thank you.
Actually, we are, as I said, both delighted and honored to have him here. My apologies for delegates who had to wait. I think Mr. Kant was caught up in another really important meeting that the UP government was organizing. Sir, if I may request you to sort of share your thoughts about role of business in G20. This is primarily a business policy audience. They will gain much by getting your view, given your involvement over the last 5-6 months, both in Indonesia and now setting the roadmap for India. And how is it that policy and business can contribute to or dovetail into the efforts that the Government of India is making? How can we make it meaningful? I know a lot will happen, so we want to be both meaningful and also positive in our contribution, something that the government can utilize in a manner that will sort of advance the agenda. So with that, I'll invite you.
Virat, Mr. Vishwanath, Vinita, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I thought this would be an interactive session. I didn't realize it would be an annual lecture on the role of business. I thought Virat will end up grilling me, but let me just say that I'm truly delighted to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be in the midst of PAFI members. Very young, very vibrant, very dynamic body, which all of you have built up in a very, very short while. I'm truly delighted because you're having this meeting during the period of India's G20 presidency. India has taken over the G20 presidency when there are multiple crises across the world. The IMF chief has just said that 1/3 of the world is getting into recession. Growth has slowed down across the world. There is a huge geopolitical crisis. Europe is reeling from high energy prices. There is a war in Ukraine. The post-COVID impact of 200 million people having gone below poverty line, about 100 million people have lost their jobs. There's a global debt crisis of over 75 countries suffering from a huge global debt impact. And there are a huge challenge of climate action and climate finance. And if we are not able to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050, then as a civilization, all of us will get impacted. So multiple crises across the world. America impacted with inflation, slow growth, Europe impacted, global debt in Africa, Latin America. In the midst of all this, India takes over the presidency of G20. To my mind, every crisis has a huge opportunity, and G20 in the past has demonstrated its ability to deliver in a moment of crisis. When the financial crisis had hit the world in 2008, G20 came out with a package which saved the world. It has played a key role in recapitalizing IMF. It has played a key role in laying out banking norms through Basel III. It has played a key role on global debt for developing countries earlier. And therefore, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity because G20 comprises of about 85% of the global GDP. It comprises of about 78% of the global trade. It comprises of 2/3 of the global population, and it comprises about 90% of the patents, and therefore it is a body which, where countries actually innovate a lot. And G20 is important because it's not like United Nations where there are 186 countries which find it difficult to arrive at a consensus. G20 is important because it's not like G7, which is a body of very few countries. G20 is important because it's the right mix of both developed and developing countries. And therefore, it has delivered in the past. So one of the key challenges for India during its G20 presidency would be to drive inclusive, resilient, and sustainable growth, because long-term sustained growth over a long period of time for the world is critical to enable citizens to benefit. And sustained growth is critical because you need structural reforms across the world in several aspects. And this would lead to better infrastructure, this would lead to creation of better demand, this would lead to consumption pickup, and this would lift people above the poverty line. And therefore, one of the key aspects will be how do you drive growth in a moment of recession across the world. Secondly, I think it's important that when 200 million people have fallen below the poverty line, that SDGs have been adversely impacted. The Sustainable Development Goals, which were to be achieved by 2030, and we are midway through 2030 in this year, instead of progressing, SDGs have actually regressed. And therefore, people have lost their job. There's been an impact due to COVID on health outcomes, on learning outcomes. And therefore, what does the world do to progress and ensure that these people who suffered during post-COVID, in the pre-COVID era, are able to bounce back and become an integral part of global economy in the post-COVID era. That's critical. And third is that climate action and climate finance is critical because the world is committed to 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050, and the Prime Minister has laid out very ambitious goals at both Paris and at Glasgow through his Panch Amrit. And India is not responsible for the carbonization of the world, it's the developed world. If you were to look at 1.5 degrees centigrade, the total carbon space available is 2,400 gigatons, out of which about almost close to 90% is occupied by the developed world. And therefore, at the 2009 Copenhagen conference, in the principle of climate justice was accepted, and it was said that every year the developed world will support developing countries which are going to industrialize in the future and support them to an extent of $100 billion per year. Now that promise has not been lived up to by the developed world. Now, India is industrializing, and therefore, in due course, it will become the third biggest polluter. And therefore, the challenge for a country like India, as it is for many other developing countries, is how do they industrialize without carbonizing the world? And that is a key challenge, and that would entail that you get into completely new areas of growth, of renewables, which India has done. It has achieved its NDC targets 9 years ahead of schedule. It has come out with a green hydrogen mission to use renewables to crack water and produce green hydrogen, and decarbonize many of the carbonizing industries like refinery, like fertilizer, like long-distance transport, steel, etc. Now, India needs to do it not for the sake of the developed world, but India needs to do it for itself. It needs to do it because it needs to provide a better quality of life for its citizens, but to be able to do that, it is important that to understand that it has good climatic conditions with which it is blessed, it has top-class entrepreneurship, but it needs long-term lending. It needs hedging instruments. It needs credit enhancement. Entrepreneurs need credit enhancement. They need blended finance. They need first loss guarantees. But for that to happen, it's not just the $100 billion from public finance from developed world, but it's also flow of resources from multilateral financial institutions which were created during the post-World War II period, the post-Bretton Woods period, and are not designed to finance both sustainable development goals and to finance climate finance. So if multilateral financial institutions were to do blended finance, etc., because it's not about developed countries, but vast pools of funds, over $200 trillion are available in the world as private resources, as private assets. For those funds to flow in, you need credit enhancement, you need blended finance, and that is important. But for that to happen, multilateral financial institutions need to be restructured to enable these to flow. So one of the key challenges will be, how do you build up multilateral institutions for the 21st century and make them flow 15x of resources of what they do to the developing world? This is critical. The fourth key challenge, and with that, will be this principle of not merely climate finance and climate action, but also what the Prime Minister has talked about as lifestyles for sustainability. Because if you were to look from COP1 to COP27, every year the developed world has talked about long-term goals from 2010 to 2020 to 2030 to 2050, but none of them have achieved short-term goals. And therefore, it's important that it's not countries, but individual and community behavior which will be important. And therefore, the Prime Minister has talked about lifestyle for environment. the nature of transportation, the nature of urbanization. How do you switch your water taps? How do you switch off electricity lights, which are constantly put on in developed world? So nudging people and communities towards behavioral change for climate consciousness, and how do you make them pro-planet people, is one of the key things which the Prime Minister has talked about, which will be an agenda. So climate action, climate finance, and lifestyle for environment. And fourthly, it's very important that we use this period to drive technological transformation. Because what India has done in the last few years, as the Bank of International Settlement has said, that India was able to create digital identities for its entire population, 1.4 billion people, was able to provide bank accounts for every single individual, and between 2015 to 2018, 470 million bank accounts were opened. 55% of the bank accounts opened across the world were opened in India, and every second bank account in the world opened was in India. We were able to digitally link bank accounts to your digital identity, and then we were able to provide mobiles. The speed of acceleration of mobility was so strong, and the data cost was so low, that everybody uses his mobile as a bank and then does all its digital transactions, not by going to physical banks. Nobody goes to physical banks. Everybody uses mobile to do transactions through India's only country which has built tracks, public tracks, on which it has allowed private sector to innovate. So PhonePe competes with Google Pay, Paytm competes with WhatsApp, and therefore India does 11x more digital payments than what US and Europe do together. We do 3x more payments than what China does. And therefore the Bank of International Settlement said that what transformation India has achieved in 7 years' time would have normally taken India 50 years' time. 50 years' time compressed in 7 years' time. That has been the technological transformation of India. Similarly, we did CoWIN, which enabled 2.5 billion people to be vaccinated, which was totally cashless, paperless. We've done a health insurance scheme for 500 million people, which is more than the population of Europe, which is cashless, paperless. You can be living in Tamil Nadu, going to Bihar, or we've done fast tags on all our national highways, or we've done improved educational outcomes during the COVID period through Diksha and Swayam. So what India did was a very different model from the big tech model of USA, where data is owned by private enterprises. And actually before this model developed in India, all the data in the world and all innovation in the world happened from big tech. So whether it was Tencent, whether it was Alibaba in China, or whether it was Facebook or Google or Microsoft in the United States, they were the innovators, they were the data keepers. India created an alternative model. So let me also say that Europe had a different model, and their model was that privacy of data is important, but when they built up the GDPR model, they focused on privacy and not on innovation. The Indian model was very distinct. It created public platforms on which it allowed private sector to innovate. And therefore, India's transformation through digital tech transformation has been just immense. And to my mind, that's a part of India's G20 narrative, that India's model is the way forward. So today in the world, there are 4 billion people without a digital identity. There are 2 billion people without a bank account. There are 133 countries in the world which do not have a digital fast payment. I mean, imagine none of them are able to do digital transaction in 133 countries because they do not have a digital identity or they do not have a bank account. Now, I've not been to a physical bank for the last 4 years. I've not been using my debit or credit card. I've not been to an ATM machine for the last 4 years. I just use my mobile for all my transactions. All this, if you want a fast track in the rest of the world, you need to accelerate the pace of digital transformation for both fast payments, for identity, for vaccination. And the other Indian narrative is what it has done in the field of health by becoming the pharmacy of the world, by becoming the vaccine capital of the world and supplying vaccination to 75 countries, by building up a health insurance scheme which took care of 500 million people below the poverty line, or by converging both yoga and Ayurveda with the modern health systems. So this is important. And India's, one of Prime Minister's key focus area has been that India's presidency is important for women-led development. And this is important because almost 48% of the global population is women. In India today, there are 1,078 women to about 1,000 men, the latest NFHS data, which shows that there are more women to men. So if India is to grow at high rates of 9 to 10%, it is not possible without women playing leadership, being in leadership position. And therefore, this challenge of ensuring that we are able to break out of this virtuous cycle of malnutrition, ensuring that we take care of the pregnant women, of the young child born for better nutrition, so that we are not able to, and the problem of stunted and wasting is because of the pregnant women being weak, and therefore taking care of them at that stage, ensuring that the learning outcomes are improved, that health outcomes are improved, that there is greater level of financial inclusion as India has done. When we started the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, only 19% of the accounts were with women. Today, the latest data shows that we have 56% of the PMJDY accounts are women-led, and therefore this transformation during this period has been from 19% to 56%, and only over 23 crore bank accounts were opened in the name of women. And similarly, with Mudra scheme, over 55% of the loans have been given to women entrepreneurs. So women-led development is a very critical component of India's G20 priorities. The Prime Minister has said that India's presidency will be inclusive, it'll be action-oriented, it'll be decisive, and it'll be ambitious. And that would mean that we will work towards driving sustainable growth, we'll work towards improving the quality of life of citizens, which he has dwelt at length in his address in the Voice of South yesterday, that will not just be the voice of the developed world, but of the vast number of citizens from the global South. And therefore, India, while being the G20 president, will also be the voice of the global South and take care of their concerns. Because one of the key challenges facing the world is about large number of these countries being going under global debt. And therefore, the challenge of the world is that we are able to ensure that countries do not collapse one after another. If that happens, then the whole economy, global financial architecture will get badly impacted. And on the financial architecture, it's important to understand that most of the debt earlier was owned by the Paris Club. A lot of that is owned now by China, and there is lending from IMF. So you need to put the Paris Club, the China lending, and the IMF, and the private sector lending all together to find a solution to this. So that's the other big challenge in the world about global debt. So ladies and gentlemen, these are very challenging moments. This is a challenge because the Prime Minister has viewed India's presidency as an opportunity to drive global change and global growth. He said that it will be action-oriented. The Indian presidency will host over 215 events in 56 cities of India. So every single city, every single state and union territory will get an opportunity to host it. Every single of these 56 cities has an opportunity to transform itself, to redo the roads, the potholes, the drainage, the sewage, the solid waste, and really give a big thrust to urbanization. This is a massive opportunity to drive travel and tourism business, because travel and tourism business is an $800 billion business where India hosts just about 4.5% of the global share. Is an opportunity to drive that into double digits. This is a huge opportunity to drive the soft power of India through its vast number of cultural programs by the state government. So not just the harder element of economy and growth, etc., but the softer element of culture, travel, tourism. This is an opportunity. There's a massive opportunity to drive the handicraft industries and exhibit them. And there's a huge, huge opportunity to ensure that India becomes a nation of both hard power and soft power. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The stars are aligned in favor of India. The stars are aligned in favor of India because the Morgan Stanley latest report says that demographics, decarbonization, digitization, and deglobalization, the 4 Ds they've used. Demographics, digitization, decarbonization, and deglobalization. 4 Ds that they've used will make the next decade as India's decade. And this can be India's decade only if business is able to utilize this opportunity. Out of all the working groups, out of all the engagement groups, the most important group is the Business 20 group. And therefore, while government decides policies, works out the communique, it's for the business today to drive the global growth. Policy is one component, but driving global supply chain, driving investments, ensuring that the global supply chain works, ensuring that we get into new sunrise areas of growth. All this is the role and function of businesses. And therefore, how businesses drive this and use this as an opportunity to make India a very, very integral part of the global supply chain. This is once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for businesses because the world is looking for new opportunities and looking for alternative destinations. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because the government has carried out all the reforms. It's brought in IBC, it's brought in low corporate taxes, it's brought in RERA, it's brought in IBC, it's redefined the definition of MSMEs. Every single reform which was pending was carried out during the COVID period. And therefore, my view is that in the coming years, we'll only accelerate the pace of growth because we've digitized our economy. We're the only country in the world where the goods and services tax is fully digital, it's totally paperless, cashless, where 99.7% of the people pay their direct tax digitally, and every single sector of the economy has now been digitized. And therefore, going digital and going green has been the big driver of growth. And with this new green hydrogen policy, the country will drive both renewables and green hydrogen. And as I said, India is truly climatically blessed. No other country in the world, including China, is climatically blessed, or even Saudi or the Middle East. No one is blessed climatically like India's is. India's top-class entrepreneurship. And our ability to become the production hub, the export hub, and the manufacturer of electrolyzer for the world, and to supply green hydrogen to decarbonize steel, refineries, fertilizer. No other country has the opportunity which India has. Today we import about $200 billion worth of fossil fuel. But we have the opportunity to industrialize without carbonizing. We have the opportunity to become the biggest exporter of clean energy by 2040. And therefore, this is an opportunity which the business must tap. And therefore, my view is that the world will look for alternative suppliers simply because we have to demonopolize, not decouple, but demonopolize the world. And there's no better place than India, and it's for Indian businesses to seize this opportunity of G20. You can never get a better opportunity, and you will never get these stars aligned in favor of India again. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, sir. Very difficult to add on any commentary to a 25-minute comprehensive presentation of everything we thought should be known. You also ruined my set of questions because you've answered most of them in terms of what the width and breadth of this whole event is going to be. Without question, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be able to host G20, also probably in India's history the biggest event that we've hosted. I suppose NAM and the African session that we had in 2015 and NAM I think in the 70s are the only big ones that sort of come to mind. Nothing nearly as big as this. So given this global attention, and you started with using the word crisis several times, and the slowdown in Europe, in the US, and the challenges. The delegates here today represent the bridge between business and the G20 dialogue, because they are the policy professionals. And they would usually represent the views of their companies and take what you've said today back to their companies. If I could ask for your views on, in specific terms, what would you like PAFI and policy professionals to think about and contribute to help advancing your work and Government of India's work in practical terms over the next, let's say, 3 or 4 months? Because I guess after July, August, it'll be just running towards the main summit. How can we, in specific terms, contribute to get the policy professionals who can speak to the business managers and engage your offices and this entire movement from the B20 point of view?
So, I think, Virat, first and foremost, that, the central government has done all the reforms. I think a lot of action is still with the states. You need about 12 Indian states to grow at high rates of 9 to 10%. Everybody is talking about 6 to 7% growth in economic terms. But it's important to understand that there are several countries in the world which have grown at 9 to 10%. And they grew at 9 to 10% because they were able to get into sunrise areas of growth. I mean, if you look at Korea, if you look at Japan in its peak days, Korea, Taiwan, China, they're very distinct from other countries because they did sustain growth over a long period of time. And they were able to do it because, firstly, they always rode the curve of new technologies. Innovation became a very integral part of their economy. And that's very different from Malaysia, Thailand, etc., which grew, but grew for a relatively short period. So if you need to sustain growth for up to 2047 at 9 to 10% of growth, innovation is key. And on the state side, there are two critical things. One is that you need about 12 to 13 champion states which grow at very high rates of 9 to 10%, and that means they must become the easiest and the simplest places to do business in. Their mindset must be one of being great facilitators and catalysts, and therefore PAFI must work with states to really drive the easiness and simplicity of businesses. And business in states must become the easiest place. They must be far ahead of the central government in easiness and simplicity. Secondly, I think they could, many of these countries could achieve it. I mean, if you look at Korea, their president actually wanted to construct this road throughout Korea, the highway, and he went to Asian Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank said this is not commercially viable. Then he went to the World Bank, and the World Bank said it's not commercially viable. And then he finally linked up this road with all the ports and made it with his own resources, and that's how Korea became a great exporting nation. Now, India has done this with its expressway, India is doing it with its roads, India is doing it with logistics, India is doing it with freight corridors, India is doing it with Gati Shakti program, all this. Now, I think we need to capitalize on this big spree of infrastructure investments for private sector to do a improved turnaround time, because it's not about building up domestic demand but becoming global champions. That is, you need to penetrate global markets. And it's important to understand that while we have a big domestic market, you get about 10x the value if you start exporting. And over a long period of time, if you're not an exporting nation, you will never be able to grow on sustained basis for a long period. So India must penetrate global markets. And this is really the key. And that means that there has to be competitive efficiency in the Indian economy. And that is what the government is struggling for and driving it. It's the productive efficiency. Whatever more can be done, PAFI should tell us and should work with every single department of the government to drive productive efficiency. And thirdly, I think I'm a believer that India must ride the wave of sunrise areas of growth. While it's important to create jobs through food processing and textiles, but there's a need to get into newer areas of growth like we are doing with mobile manufacturing or electric mobility or green hydrogen or renewables. These are the new areas of growth which will drive growth. And these will be the areas where new jobs will happen. And therefore, my belief is that by opening up space, by opening up drones, by opening up electric mobility, by opening up, every single area will be driven by data in terms of AI and ML. And therefore, artificial intelligence must become integral to every sector of the economy, and it must become integral to every single department of the government. That will be the way forward. And PAFI should really lead the initiative on many of these new sunrise areas of growth, which will be the key areas to drive growth. So PAFI should not be just a public relations body. It should not be just a body it should not be a trade union body. It should have the vision, the foresight, and the big canvas and the perspective of taking India to a $10 trillion economy. And that would require a lot of bold, innovative thinking, which should come from PAFI and the private sector and the businesses.
Thank you. All of these in terms of engagement with states, pointing out the disabilities that we suffer vis-a-vis some of the competing economies, because you talked about exports and pushing forward on innovation. All three very valuable suggestions. I sort of commit to you on behalf of my colleagues and the SC that we would certainly focus on this. We try and engage states as much as possible, but I think we need to do more without question. On the disabilities that India suffers, your point is well taken. Unless we provide that assessment to the government, they're not in a position to assist. In fact, the PLI scheme came from a specific assessment of disabilities, which has now been addressed in several sectors. My colleagues, if you have a question, please go ahead.
We should open it up also to others. Well, sir, one of the suggestions which we had was from PAFI is when we look at the various working groups within the government, which is trying to bring in the Indian agenda for the G20. How would you think we can start contributing, given the fact that we have membership which deals with most of the critical areas which you outlined so beautifully during your speech? What kind of inputs do you think as PAFI we could give in, which would help in helping business provide those inputs to you in this?
If I could just illustrate that, for example, you've spoken about sustainable growth a lot. You talked
Yes.
about climate, you talked about climate financing, you talked about changing the role of multilaterals going forward for climate financing, which is a difficult task, but an important one. How would the private sector, for example, in that one space, that I think almost everybody in this room is concerned with, leading from serious climate issues to CSR to performance to e-waste, how do we sort of engage specifically on the G20 piece on climate as a business contribution?
Getting into specifics, I think both on the energy side, energy working group, and on the environment working group, there are many side events which will be held. I think on you should pick up one area of circular economy, or you can pick up life, or you can pick up any issue, and that can become your side event for that. More than that, I think you should work in partnership with Business 20 to do one day of event. PAFI should do a complete one day of business event only on sustainability, working with the private sector, both multinationals and Indian companies together on what can be done to drive sustainability for G20 companies across the world, not just for India, but for the world.
Thank you. Go ahead. Can we get a mic here?
This is a great honor for PAFI. I was telling my colleagues, we've seen you over the last 20 years in different avtaras, and many of the founding principles of PAFI is based on our discussions with you, with 5-6 people in Habitat, to today at Leela with 200 people. So thank you very much for kicking off PAFI New Year's by giving this excellent overview of G20. Sir, you have several things to do, 200 plus events, but I'll put in one more. We've been privileged for you to be part of the social sector, the social entrepreneurs. And you've been sitting on the jury, and you've seen some of the contributions of the social sector. This is one idea, sir, for your consideration. Maybe at the end of the G20, to have a grouping on social sector. G20, as you've said, 80% of the GDP is covered in G20. The social sector, the social entrepreneurs, the corporates, social think tanks, the corporates are also working a lot on CSR. So this is one suggestion, and I'll write to you separately. But please do consider this. Thank you so much.
No, it's a very important point because I've worked very closely in the aspirational district program. I've worked with traditional fisheries sector of Kerala to enhance their productivity, and I think it's a very important point. But there are various civil society groups. There's a civil society group, there's a youth 20, there's a women 20. Women 20 is bringing self-help groups of women. Similarly, there's a startup group. So all these groups are available to you to bring social entrepreneurs together. You should work with several of these engagement groups to work on social enterprises and demonstrate the unique Indian model of social entrepreneurship.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Amar Varyava from Michelin India Private Limited. First of all, thank you for the power-packed the presentation, and Happy New Year to you. When I see all this, I can clearly say that the government has a feet on ground and eyes on horizon. Very clearly, you have articulated about various aspects, which is very inclusive. Sir, my specific question to you is that you said that India should penetrate global market through more effective export. I think, in the global scenario, there should be a balancing act. During COVID, definitely we have put some import restriction. And now the situation is becoming more normal, economy is growing. Don't you think that the exporting only from this part of the world is not actually balancing that act? Because I've seen for some of the commodities the export has reduced over a period of time. And the countries where we are exporting, they are also saying that you are not taking any import from our side. So why we should do the export activity? So what is your thought on that to have a free trade kind of the environment? Because many countries would like to invest heavily in this part of the world, and they also see the character of the countries. So would like to know your thoughts on that. Thank you.
No, it's a very important question, and I think some of you should read this book called How Asia Works. And when England was growing, for many years, it had put very high import duties on imported goods. And it allowed free access to its exports into India, and that's how actually India's textiles got destroyed. Calico and all this got destroyed. So the Manchester textiles grew out of protectionism of UK. America has been the master, forget all this talk about free trade, huh? America's history, you look at it, been the master of protectionism. Look at the new Inflation Reduction Act. They are saying we'll subsidize green hydrogen to a percent of 3%, $3 per kilogram for green hydrogen to be produced in the United States. The cost of production in the United States is $7.50. The cost of production in India is $4.50. You'll end up producing uncompetitive green hydrogen, which has brought green hydrogen projects from Australia to India to a standstill. So, important thing for India to do is that there is an import intensity to export. You have to export certain things. There is an import intensity to that export. You can't export unless and until you don't import those components. So there's an import intensity to the exports, and we should allow those imports to come in, do value addition and export. But there are a lot of consumer products which India is capable of manufacturing. I mean, why should we not do furniture making? Or toys. Those are areas I think we've allowed a lot of, at zero rates of duties, we've allowed a lot of those imports to come in, and I think we should be very, very tight on them. But we should be very clever to allow imports of components which go into exports so that we are able to penetrate global markets. And so, if you have to grow at high rates for some time and build up your domestic capability, if you allow, say, finished tires to come in, then Indian, at very low rates of duty, then many of the tire manufacturing companies will get impacted and so on. So I think we need to be very, very clear. We need to be very astute. We need to be very strategic. We need to think of the big picture. And that's what UK had done. That's what America had done. That's what China has done. So let us not get carried away by this talk of, can't compare India of today with the United States of America today. You have to look at what policy they adopted when they were industrializing, what policies were adopted by UK when they were industrializing. They were highly protectionist policies. And I think it will be very good for some of you to read two brilliant articles by a young journalist called, I think her name is Diva Jain in Mint. 2-3 days back she's written on industrial policy. Her name is Diva Jain. Very good articles to understand how industrial policy worked in UK and USA.
Thank you for that. I'll just come, actually a small intervention that, I see two hands up, and I'll come to them. We're doing exactly that. So we basically, Commerce Secretary, who's also a trained economist, we presented the fact that we need to look at specific tariff lines where we need to be competitive. Because if you're going to wait for an FTA, that's going to take a long time. And the one country that you probably wanted to mention but didn't, and we compete the hardest with, is Vietnam. And they have the cleverest trade policy. They have the finest FTAs any country can imagine, both from countries they import and they export. In the absence of that, what we need to be doing is what you exactly said, be savvy about the tariff lines that you import to produce and to export. And so that is something that's kind of, I think, sinking in with the Commerce Ministry and hopefully with Department of Revenue, because it gets down to that. Pranjal here, and then Smriti, and then a gentleman there. I'm just going to go that way.
Amitabh
I'm just going in the order I see the hands. Please go ahead.
So always inspired whenever I hear you. There's so much notes to take and so much to figure out. I have a question on the role of business. Yesterday, the Prime Minister spoke at the Voice of Global South Summit, and he said that India has to lead the Global South in setting the rules of the world. Now, that is happening already. When you look at seeking IPR waiver for COVID vaccines, the big pharma gets upset and uncomfortable. When you set rules for the big tech to play in India, they get upset because, we are trying to protect us. We are not like China where they're not even allowed. If you look at
for example, UPI is going to be allowed for remittances, $100 billion business. Somebody is going to lose when UPI rises. My question to you, and I think as a friend of PAFI to PAFI, is that what role can business play in helping reduce the resistance to this change which is happening? And I'm sure you face and the central government faces this on a nearly daily basis.
So, two things. One is that a lot of more innovation and business models have to come out. Not merely for India, but for the global markets. And the more innovation, I mean, look at what India did. It's not just about fast payments. We must understand this, that we were able to do digitization, we did fast payments. But on the back of that fast payments, looking at the payment history, you had a number of startups which started doing paperless, cashless lending. You know, MobiKwik and all this are doing lending because of, on the credit history. Then you had a number of young startups all becoming unicorn who started doing paperless, cashless wealth creation. Look at Zerodha, for instance. Zerodha is big unicorn because stockbroking, all that, they started doing all paperless, cashless. And then you had another set of startups which started doing insurance, underwriting of the whole insurance. You know, when I used to take insurance, it used to be massive paperwork with LIC, scanning days and days. Today you get an insurance policy on Digit and Acco within 2 minutes. So it's this process of digitization which has enabled you to do that, so that your market is not 1.4 billion people. Your market is the 5 billion people who are moving from poverty to middle class. And your market is not about making driverless cars like Apple is trying or like Google is trying. Your market is transforming lives of people through new technology, and that is a huge, huge opportunity for businesses, I think.
I thought you'd embarrass me on at least one thing, so. There's a lady there in the back. I'm sorry, I can't see her. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi.
Yes.
I'm Krish from Ola
Krish, sorry,
Electric. Great to hear the focus on access to finance. Of course, that's a big piece of the puzzle to solve. It will be great to hear from you, Mr. Kant, how you see the IRA Act of the US, that they've brought in, pumping billions of dollars in financing new energy and decarbonization journey. And do you hear about something along the lines, or differently maybe, how Indian government is approaching putting in money into this transition?
No, so Inflation Reduction Act of USA is very good for USA to get the size and scale for them. In some of these areas, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's not Inflation Reduction Act. They titled it as Inflation Reduction Act, but it's a highly protectionist act. I've said this. If green hydrogen is to be produced, if you have to get, you have. See, we must understand this, that even if India does 100% of its energy on electricity on renewable, suppose we were to do everything renewable, electricity is only 20% of your energy, 20%. Balance 80% of your energy is what you use in refinery, in fertilizer, in steel, and long distance transport, which is coal or imported fuels. So we do 200 billion worth of imported fuel. You have to decarbonize these areas, not electricity. You have to decarbonize refinery, you have to decarbonize steel, you have to decarbonize fertilizer. The only way to do it is through green hydrogen. Now, when you make renewable, you crack water to produce green hydrogen. India can be the cheapest producer, the cheapest exporter, the cheapest manufacturer of electrolyzer. Our cost of manufacturing is $4.50, United States cost is $7.50. United States says, I'll subsidize it to an extent of $3. Only for those who produce in USA. What the USA should do, like Europe has done, is to say that I'll subsidize $3 for the cheapest producer in the world, if you believe in free trade. So, I mean, I'll buy from wherever you produce the cheapest. It says that we believe in demand and supply, and we believe in productive efficiency, so India will be the cheapest producer if you don't start subsidizing only USA. That's my argument. So we should allow in some of these key areas where you need size and scale for prices to fall from $7.5 to $1 by 2030. You need size and scale across the world, and that's important.
Thank you. Last 3 or 4 questions. Smriti Sharma, I'm going to come to you, sir. After her, I'm going to come to you. Go ahead, Smriti.
Yeah, good afternoon,
No,
sir.
there's somebody behind you who went up before you. Please take a seat. After her, sit down. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Virat. It's serendipity, sir. Last time I asked you a question about national logistics policy, and it came through in the very next month. So I'm hoping that this time I ask you a question about the labor reforms, and they will come through. About the labor reforms. So the reason I bring that up is because I think last year we did a fantastic job on the national logistics policy, bringing out Gati Shakti, and that infrastructure, that digital infrastructure we've built behind the hard infrastructure to ensure that completion and all that happens and is kept track of. I think the next follow-up, sir, I would want to submit is fueling the gig economy in this country. And because the forum is being led by you, the G20, I would urge, sir, that we do not look at gig economy from the Western lens, and we do not look at it from the protectionist lens that West is looking at gig economy right now. India needs jobs, we need to fuel that economy, and we need to make sure that women, old people who are available to work are also absorbed in this gig workforce. We have a huge need for jobs. I think the questions that we need to think about, and we are already rightly thinking about, are the social security benefits that need to be passed on to this gig economy. The things that we should not be worried about right now is how to regulate gig economy. It's too nascent. It has just started. It's just come, and we are just still trying to shape it up. So no over-regulation, and I think there is a tendency now in the West to go a little more towards collectivization efforts. It's like they've suddenly woken up to that, but I think we have experienced it already. We've experienced it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and I don't think we want to go on that path. And it would be good if we can just unshackle the gig economy from that collectivization threat that we are trying to dismantle through our labor codes. So I guess that little schizophrenia that we have sometimes in our policy domains from one end and the other end, they need to be resolved so that we know which path we are taking. And I guess, sir, you will be our Sherpa in G20 to just show them that the right path forward is of one where jobs need to be created. They do not need to be shackled.
Yeah. No, I entirely agree with you. I entirely agree with you that we need to not put too many rules and regulations. The gig economy will continue to grow and expand as we get into many new areas of growth. If you put too many regulations, we will kill it. I don't think the government's intention is to bring in regulations on that at all. Just to ensure that they have some kind of a social protection. That's all. Nothing to regulate. I don't think we should end up regulating. That's not the intention at all. And the objective is that these are new sectors of growth which will drive your economy in due course, and the gig economy is bound to grow in the years to come.
Last 2 questions. We need to break for lunch. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir, and thanks for the insightful views you shared with us. I got 2 questions and your views on that. First is the role of MSMEs, because we got a lot of informal SMEs in India, and if India need to become the production hub for the world, then role of MSMEs is going to be critical. Digitization is the focus for G20 this time, how we can take advantage, and we already got strategic benefits of being the leading player actually in terms of IT and digital world, how we can take benefit of that. Secondly, if we need to move ahead actually in terms of startups and manufacturing leadership, then role of research and innovation also going to be important. What is your views actually how we can connect the dots between industry, academia, and the executors actually, yeah, because these days a lot of gaps are there actually in my view, okay. I want to know your views on that actually, on these 2 parts.
So one is we must understand that G20 is not a solution for all the problems of India. I mean, don't expect G20 to solve all the challenges of India. MSME is very important because it's a big job creator. It needs to digitize, number one. It's a very major player of contribution to industry on exports, on labor creation. Therefore, it needs to digitize. It's very important. And second on MSME is that the new account aggregator model which the RBI has built with data empowerment is very important, that you will then be able to get credit based on your past history. And that is what banks have started doing with account aggregator systems. So credit flow will, which has been a big challenge for MSMEs, will then start working. And that's important. We've created a new startup working group in G20. That's because India has done very well in terms of the number of startups. When we started the Startup India movement in 2016, there were just about 116 startups. Today we have 88,000 startups. We have about 110 unicorns. So they've done most of the disruption. But most of the disruption that has happened is because of going digital. But the next wave of this has to be to go green, because the world is going to attract capital. Those companies and those countries will attract capital. Those countries and those companies will attract valuation, which are going green. And therefore, going digital and going green is really the key.
Yes, sir. Last question.
Sir, I will be respectful of your time and the audience here. CISS has issued a report on geopolitics of green hydrogen. And one of the challenges which has been identified is the transportation of the green hydrogen. I know you have been the greatest champions of green hydrogen. For us, India, how are we looking at creating big industrial parks and sort of getting into manufacturing of green hydrogen and immediately trying to utilize rather than transporting, because that's going to be a big challenge.
No, see, green hydrogen has to be produced next to ports. You have to, green hydrogen in its liquid form is ammonia. And ammonia can be transported on LNG tankers today. So it's, you can sell ammonia to the entire world from India. You can use, we use fertilizer. Fertilizer is nothing but ammonia in its liquid form. Why should we use hard feed for fertilizer? We can use ammonia for fertilizer. Ammonia is very much transportable in its liquid form. All LNG tankers can export, you can transport ammonia. It's not a challenge at all, liquid form. Green hydrogen is difficult to transport, not ammonia.
So before you end, I just want to identify there is a lot of young people here. We're done with questions. I'm sorry, I'll have to end it here. There are a lot of young people here, students who've come in here from the Indian School of Public Policy, who look forward to making a career in policy making, who will be the future of the engagement between the government and the private sector. Sometimes some of them will be in the government, in the in the cooperative sector, in the think tank sector. A message for them, because this is they're in the 20s, I think, late 20s, and for them, G20 it would be for us when NAM was hosted. It was like this. It is very big. If you could just all raise your hand, all the young people over here. So you see a lot of students who we always bring in. We always try and bring in young people to sort of attend these meetings. A message for them, and what do you think they would take away from this? What they should focus on, and how this would go down in their memory as a very big event when they were young and India was shaping itself.
So the difference between NAM and Chogam and all was that they were events for 2 days. And the World Cup in Qatar was about 11 or 12 days. G20 is year round. I mean, it's for a whole year. So it's far more complex, far more difficult. It's 10x of what the World Cup in Qatar was. And it's spread out throughout the year. It's 100x more complex than what NAM and Chogam were. But G20 is a huge, huge opportunity. And for public policy students, it's very important that we constantly adopt policies which are progressive and forward-looking, which bring in predictability, which bring in consistency of policies. In India, that is really the key. Making things easy, simple, scrapping a lot of rules, regulation which were built for a socialist era, which the Prime Minister has focused on, dismantling a lot of rules, regulation. Everything should be digital. There should be no paperwork. There should be no human touch at all. That's the key to good public policy.
So, talking of the World Cup, I'm going to turn to my colleague for the vote of thanks for our Messi.
Mr. Khan, you started by saying you weren't sure if this was a lecture or an interaction. It can be a seamless interaction, it seems. And who better than you? Because I think we've really understood the insides of G20 coming from you. It really mirrors the aspirations of our people. And what is so great about your giving us these inputs is that, you know, despite the headwinds, the opportunities that we have today, and like you said, G20 is an year-round agenda. May I just add that more than a year-round agenda, India has the opportunity, and so does the business, to put in new benchmarks. You know, it won't go away after a year either. What we set for us as targets would be high enough for other countries, be in circular finance, be in women-led growth, be in MSMEs, be in AI, ML, would be such wonderful targets for the world to catch on to once G20 presidency is handed over by India. So I think as PAFI, you've given us a wonderful task, and I think many of our businesses are already involved in B20 track, T20, even W20, and Empower 20. And I think together, this will be a wonderful cross stream of ideas, and I hope with all our members here, who I really wish to thank for being with us today, we should now sit down and put our draft together to be more engaged in this consultative process. Before you all go off for lunch, I would really want to place my thanks to Apple and to Virat, you specifically, for taking up such an important subject today. To all our friends from the missions who have joined us today, we would love to strengthen our public policy dialogue and more with you. And to our friends from media who are here with us and think tanks, thank you so much. In addition, I want to thank Genesis for always, you know, reaching out with this outreach to more people through the media help. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Kant, and we are with you in this and seek your guidance.
Can I request all the young people from the policy school to come up, take a photograph for Mr. Khan? This will be a good thing for you to remember in the year of G20. Please, all of you rush up quickly. So we'll take up, this is impromptu, we didn't decide this, but it'll be a good thing for you to remember that you were with the Sherpa in this year. Please, please come up, just line up there, and then we'll try and take a photograph. Come, everybody come up here. Okay. Don't be shy, please come up quickly. We have a minute to do this. Go ahead, please take a photo.
Buffet, which is outside, please. Thank you so much.